This is going to be a little odd. What I'm going to talk about is mostly kind of conceptual, so, no new facts, just a few simple old facts. I want to talk about a different way of looking at the old facts, and a different way which, if correct, will also naturally be a way of looking at new facts. This is a whole big picture that's been developing for several years, and I can only just touch on parts of it, and I'll try to make it, at least coherent, but it can only be a sketch. I only want to indicate, the kind of program that I've been thinking about and the direction it goes and the kind of questions that come up, and touch on a few of the cases for illustration, but I can't, there'll be nothing like filling in the blanks. So I'll just try to see if I can make it intelligible, and hope there'll be some material out not too long in print which you can look at. Basic assumptions are the familiar ones. Let me just review. So I'm assuming that there's a language faculty. It characterizes a set of generative procedures. So we have something gives us a set of generative procedures. Each generative procedure, say GI, gives a certain set of structural descriptions. Each structural description is a collection of levels of representation. We can identify a linguistic expression with a structural description. They're the same thing. And we can identify a language from the point of view of this approach with a generative procedure. Sometimes I suggested calling that an I language, meaning to indicate that the conception of language that comes out of this is internalist, and just has to do with what's inside the head, and intentional. That is, you care about the actual form of the generative procedure, not whatever it generates. So two different generative procedures could in principle generate the same set of linguistic expressions, structural descriptions. The grammar is the theory of the generative procedures. Universal grammar is the theory of the initial state of the language faculty, which characterizes a set of generative procedures. So we start with that. An I language, a generative procedure, is embedded in performance systems. There appear to be two kinds of performance systems. There's one kind which is articulatory, perceptual, kind of sensory. There's another kind which is sensory motor. There's another kind which is conceptual or intentional with a T, meaning having to do with actions of speech acts and so on. Now, if that's the case, then the set of structural descriptions is going to have two interface levels. So let's assume that among the levels that are in here, there are two that are interface levels, that is, levels of representation which contain whatever information is relevant to the respective performance system. So there'll be one interface level that is the interface between the language faculty and sensory motor systems, perceptual, articulatory, and there'll be another level which is the interface with conceptual, intentional systems. Well, conventionally, the first one has always been assumed to be phonetic representation or phonetic form. The second has been more controversial, the conceptual, intentional, and I'm going to assume a roughly EST type framework, so I will take it to be LF, logical form. Its properties, empirical, to be determined. Now, I assume, as usual, that the basic problem of the field, what sort of defines the field, is the problem of explanatory adequacy, or sometimes called the logical problem of language acquisition, the problem of the mapping from primary linguistic data to a particular generative procedure, usual assumptions. An I language, I will also assume, furthermore, has two parts, and which is almost a conceptual necessity. It's a computational system, so it therefore must have atoms of some sort, and it must make computations on them. The atoms are the lexicon, the computational system is the computational system, and the I language has a lexicon and a computational system. You can debate what the boundaries are, but it's hard to imagine an alternative to that. And universal grammar, the theory of the initial state, determines the set of generative procedures. Okay, that's basic framework. So far, that's pretty much the domain of conceptual necessity. Everything I've just said more or less has to be true if the general approach is on target. Maybe there's some other way of looking at things that nobody's thought of, but That's always possible. But if the whole approach is somewhere near on target, what I just said is essentially conceptual necessity. Haven't departed from that domain yet. Now, any assumption that goes beyond conceptual necessity requires empirical justification, obviously. So we could define what we might call, let's say, a minimalist program in linguistic theory. And the minimalist program says there isn't anything beyond conceptual necessity. Anything else is just a mistake, misunderstanding. We haven't understood things. Well, that's not a specific program. That's more or less an attitude, because I haven't filled in a lot of the specific details about what a generative procedure is and what it does and so on and so forth. But you can take it as a kind of an indication of a direction to pursue. To what extent can we show that the nature of language is determined by conceptual necessity, and to what when we adopt the right perspective, and to what extent do we have to build machinery, technology that is there just to make things work, although they wouldn't have had to be given the nature of the system. And of course, it would be an improvement if we could approach the minimalist program. Well, what I'd like to review is work which suggests that to quite a surprising degree, I think, you can achieve the minimalist program, or come pretty remarkably close to it in ways I wouldn't have expected, if you adopt the right perspective. You have to adopt exactly the right perspective in precise detail to what a computation is and what a representation is and so on. But if you adopt that perspective on pretty natural assumptions, I think, you can in fact come pretty close to and maybe reach something like a minimalist program. And as I say, I'll only be able to give the flavor of this. Well, one part of this right perspective is going to be what I'll call economy considerations, vaguely speaking, sort of least effort type considerations, which are a natural part of computational systems, but not a necessary part. We have to make them very clear, because a lot's going to depend on what they are. Economy considerations have been around ever since the beginnings of generative grammar. It's over 40 years now, 45 years or so. In the beginning, they entered into the subject essentially in the following way. The assumption was that universal grammar, which does generate, it specifies a set of languages, that's what its nature is, that the way it does this is by determining a format for rule systems. So universal grammar gives a format for rule systems. It says you can have phrase structure rules and transformational rules, and they got to look like this, and they have to be integrated in this way, and you have traffic rules connecting the transformations and so on. And then the way that the way you achieve explanatory adequacy, that is going from primary linguistic data to particular generative procedure, the way you do this is by finding a rule system consistent with the data and applying an evaluation metric and showing that the one you've picked is the most highly valued. Okay, that's, you look at, say, work of the mid-50s, say, logical structure of linguistic theory, that's the framework. The framework is, you got a format for rule system. Universal theory of language tells you a format for rule systems, which says here's the possible languages. Sometimes they're called grammars, that's just an ambiguity. I'll call them languages. Here you have the format for rule systems. Then you have a way of choosing among alternative formats which are consistent with the data. You pick the most economical one, and that's the language. That's what the child does. A child has some data, knows what the right rule systems are, has an evaluation metric, picks the most economical instantiation of the rule system given the data. That's where the economy considerations fit it in, and that's where you get things like counting features and all this kind of stuff. Now, that of course had a pretty traditional flavor to it, and in fact, early generative grammar was quite intelligible to traditional grammarians, pretty much unintelligible to structural linguists, and the reason is it did have more or less of a traditional flavor to it. You had rules and constructions and rules for the constructions and so on and so forth. I'm not suggesting it was understood what it was about, but it kind of like could be, you could talk to each other. It was worlds apart from structural linguistics, almost unintelligible. And Now, over the years, what has, and in many ways it did pick up traditional concerns, over the years, the sort of course of work has tended to shift things considerably, reducing the class of possible rule systems to the point where they disappeared. So by, say, 1980 or so, when you get to principles and parameters type theories, there aren't any rule systems. There are no rules, there's no constructions, there's no rule system. The whole of the traditional approach to language for the last couple thousand years is out the window. What you have just is fixed invariant principles and parametric options. And there aren't any constructions, there are taxonomic epiphenomena and hence no rules. But of course that also means there's no evaluation metric. The assumption is that the initial state of the language faculty is so constrained that given the primary linguistic data, there's only one generative procedure consistent with it, namely the one that has its parameters fixed given the primary linguistic data. Okay, now if that's the case, there is, I mean, then you have that's a much superior theory. If it's true, it's a big progress. It comes much closer to dealing with the basic problem of explanatory adequacy. Of course, there's a question whether it's true, but assuming that it's true. That eliminates the economy considerations in their old form. There's no longer any evaluation metric because there aren't any alternatives. The choice of a language is just fixed. You check off the parameters, you got the language. So Hungarian is some set of parameter settings, and Swahili is a different set of parameter settings, and that's it. And the child just has to answer a questionnaire. You know, is this an all-subject language? Is this a head-first language? Things like that. And so we're out. In the old sense, the economy considerations disappeared in the course of this project and progress. On the other hand, they keep coming up again in another context, and I think they're very crucial, and I think it's necessary to focus on them, or so I want to suggest. And they come in two varieties, two quite natural varieties. One has to do with representations, and the other has to do with computations. And intuitively, what they ought to say is that there are no superfluous, this is intuitive, you have to make it precise, there are no superfluous elements in representations, and there are no superfluous steps in derivations. Derivations or whatever are formed by the computational system, by the generative procedure. So those are the economy considerations. They say nothing extra that you don't need in representations and nothing extra that you don't need in derivations. In that sense, the system will be maximally economical. Now again, to make this mean something, we got to say exactly what these two notions mean. This is just, intuitive background. But if we can get it, we're still within very much of a minimalist program. These are very general kinds of notions, if you can make some sense. So let's proceed with that. And imagine what a particularly simple design of language would be. You're God and you're inventing language and you want to make it very simple. What would you do given these conceptual necessities? Well, first of all, as far as the general design is concerned, the optimal one is the principles and parameters approach. It says there's basically one language. There's one computational system, fixed, no variation. There are parameters, and the parameters are restricted to the lexicon. So it's pretty traditional in a sense. The lexicon was always described as the residue of idiosyncrasies in a language, and this approach makes it explicit. Says there's one computational system, so no problem learning that one, because there's nothing to learn. And the lexicon does vary. That's where the variation among languages is. Well, inside the lexicon, there's a lot that is not up for grabs. That's pretty clear. So the choice of substantive elements doesn't look as if it varies, though they're there. You can have different selections of them. There are a few things that vary. There's traditional Saussurean arbitrariness, what sound goes with what symbol, but that's trivial. And there's functional elements allow a certain variation. So grammatical elements allow a certain, and I suspect rather limited variation. I'll be talking about that. Apart from that, there will be some options in the PF component, which is natural. That's the kind that's more or less accessible, so you'd expect options to be tolerable and well within the bounds of learnability. That would be, so far, kind of an optimal design. And to make it completely optimal, you want to say that there's nothing in the structural description except the interface levels. So remember, the interface levels are forced. The language, it's just a fact about language, an irreducible fact, that it's used for speaking and hearing and referring and asking questions and so on and so forth, and that those two, that mass of activities appears to fall into two categories, the perceptual articulatory and the conceptual intentional. If so, there have to be at least two interface levels, so let's assume that there are only those two and there's nothing else. So the structural description from an optimal point of view would be precisely a set of pairs P, F, where P is a representation at the phonetic level, F, and L is a representation at the LF level, and that's it. A linguistic expression is just a pair of such representations, and that'll mean that all conditions on representations, like say binding theory or case theory or whatever, will have to be conditions on those two things. Not on anything else. In fact, there won't be anything else, so there can't be conditions on anything else. Well, that would be an optimal design. It would say conditions are all only at the interface levels, the ones that are forced to exist by conceptual necessity. And what would a linguistic expression be in that case? Well, a linguistic expression in a kind of a optimal theory would be simply the optimal realization of the interface conditions with the parameters set. So you want to pick Hungarian, you have to set the parameters. But once you've set the parameters, which will be pairing of phonetic and lexical elements, so Saussurean arbitrariness, and whatever options are permitted among the functional categories, and some things about phonetics. Once you fix that, you've got Hungarian, and now if you want to know what an expression of Hungarian is, well, it would be this. It would be the optimal realization of interface conditions, where the interface conditions are universal, and optimality has a universal definition. Okay, and that's all there is. That would be kind of a beautiful design for language. And it's about as minimalist as possible. So let's ask if you can approach that. That's the question I want to pursue. Well, we have to now spell out what a computational system is. Okay, so far I've just given it a name and what optimality is and so on. Well, what is a computational system? A computational system is something that takes representations and turns them into other representations. Okay, takes symbolic representations, converts them into other symbolic representations, which means that one part of UG, one part of this whole theory must be a procedure which selects elements from the lexicon and presents them in a form which is accessible to the computational system. Lexicon is just atoms. You've got to have some method in the system which takes the atoms, puts them in a form accessible to the computational system so that it can then grind away and meet the interface conditions. Okay, that's, again, conceptual necessity. Now, at this point, well, first of all, what is the form that's accessible to computations? Here there seems to be very strong reason to believe that the form that's accessible to computations is just projections of lexical elements, nothing else. In other words, X-bar theory. So let's assume what appears to be the minimal possible form of X-bar theory, the one which says you have a head, X0, and it may or may not have a complement, let's call it ZP, and that may or may not have a specifier, and that's it. So let's take that to be X-bar theory for the moment. The minimal possibility given the most elementary fact. The complement system is connected to things like theta rolls and so on, and the specifier system has other properties which I'll come back to. Now, a minimalist approach would say there's nothing but this. This is the form in which computational representation. This is the form in which lexical items appear. You got a lexical item projected to this thing. That's the form in which, and you do this for a whole bunch of things, and you get an expression which is then subject to computation. So far, we're still within a minimalist theory, and if we really want to keep to it, we will also want to reach the conclusion, and here it becomes not so obvious, we want to reach the conclusion that the essential relations, the conditions on the interface are going to be expressed in terms of various kinds of relations, okay, obviously. And we would want to say that the essential relations are those that are forced on you by conceptual necessity and nothing else. That would be a minimalist program. Well, what's forced on you by conceptual necessity? Well, two things. The relation of a head, what would it be forced on you by conceptual? It would have to be expressible. The relations, any relation would have to be expressible in X-bar theoretic terms. It would be a relation to a head, because that's what everything goes to. So, and furthermore, it would presumably be minimal itself, that is local. The closest relationship between anything and a head is a possible relation. Well, that means two possible relations, ypz and xzp, ypx and zpx, in other words, specifier head and head complement. Order, as usual, irrelevant. This is not complement. Bad notation here. Okay, so usual assumptions about order. This is abstract and order-free. Those are the two local relations. Notice that excludes the possibility of a relation between a head and something internal to XP to ZP. Okay, and in a minimalist theory, these would be the only possible relations. I'll slightly extend this later, but as a start, those would be the only possible relations. Crucially, that excludes head government. Head government is a different relation. Head government is a relation between X and something inside ZP. And it's not a relation between X and YP unless you extend to M command, which has all sorts of other problems. I'm assuming everybody knows what I'm talking about. I hope that's right. I'm not defining a term. Not asked. Okay? So such a minimalist approach right off excludes head government. It's not a possible relationship. Now that's already serious because there's a lot of evidence, empirical evidence, that seems to turn on head government. In fact, in principles and parameters theory, that's been the core notion, core unifying notion. But if a minimalist program is correct, there is no such concept. So that's, not non-obvious move number one. We would have to show, to pursue a minimalist program, big task will be to show that everything that's been formulated in terms of head government is wrongly formulated. And in fact, it reduces to the more fundamental X-bar theoretic notions of local X-bar theoretic relations, as conceptual necessity would require. Well, so take, for example, case theory. Standard approach to case theory says that structural case theory, I'm talking about, not, inherent case theory presumably is this relation. But structural case theory, the standard approach says there's two, in a nominative accusative language, there's two cases, two basic cases. There's nominative case, which is spec head. It's a relation of this to this, where this is some kind of inflectional element. And then there's another relationship, which is head, like say verb, to something that it head governs, which might be this, or might be something inside this. For example, an exceptional case marking. And that makes the theory of structural case heterogeneous. One subcase of it is spec head, the other subcase of it is head government, and the two are quite different in that the head government one is not a local X-bar theoretic relation. And we have pretty good reason to believe that we couldn't just say that the accusative case is this relation. Well, exceptional case marking is for or small clauses and so on is the case that shows that. So if this approach is correct, we've got to say there's something wrong with that standard picture. Well, there is an approach that suggests that there's something wrong with it and offers a way to unify structural case theory under spec head relation. And it's an approach that has independent support, I think. That's the approach that comes out of kind of a generalization of Pollak's, Jean-Yves Pollak's approach, which I think has a good deal of plausibility. And there's a description of the extension that I have in mind in a paper of mine called something, I forget what, something about economy, which came out a couple months ago. And the approach is basically like this, extending Pollock. It says that the basic structure of a clause looks like this. Its head is a complement. Well, I'll use terms like specifier, but you understand that these are just names of a functional position. It's not a category. And this is the head, so we're now talking there. Complements necessarily pick IPs. That's just their nature. Complementizers are basically force indicators on clauses. That's their function, so they automatically pick an IP for what they select. We have to ask what this means. I'm just using it informally. An IP is going to have a specifier and some bar, and then an element here, and I'll be assuming that the element there is an agreement element, and let's call it agra S, but that's just a notation. I'll come back to it. And this will have a complement, and for reasons which I'll come back to, that has to be a tense phrase, and that will again have a tense element and its complement, and that will again be an agra phrase, call it agra O, and that will have specifier and a complement and an agreement element. This is agra O, and that'll have a complement, namely VP, and the VP will have V. The VP will in fact have a specifier and a V and its complement, some VP. So that's the structure of a clause. Let's assume now the verb phrase internal subject hypothesis generalized to all predicates. So that means that the external argument is going to be this guy, and the internal argument will be this guy, plus other things down below. Notice that I've so far assumed just a binary system, kind of a Keynes-style unambiguous path theory, okay, on the minimalist assumptions. So that's the basic structure of a clause, and we will then say that, as usual, this is the nominative case relation, and this, which is the analog, is the accusative case relation, okay? Now then the question of case assignment, objective case assignment, doesn't have anything to do with head government. It has to do with when something down here can get to this position. Okay, so exceptional case marking will reduce to the conditions under which raising takes place. If raising can take place to get something up here, it'll enter in structural case, but there's no head government. That'll be the approach. And if you can pursue that, then all of the case features fall together, nominative, accusative, and so on. Notice agreement also falls together. Agreement will just be, we have to look more closely at this element. What is it? I'm assuming that this is a set of 5 features. That means in the standard sense, so things like gender, number, person, whatever else it may be. And agreement is just the spec-head relation. That's this one. It's an expression of the spec-head relation where the head is just agra. Now what about case? Well, case is essentially the same thing, but with one slight difference. We know that case involves the properties of the tense element and of the verb. There are accusative and unaccusative verbs. There are nominative and non-nominative tenses. Finite versus infinitive, we call them. So it's a very general and not controversial fact about language is that the character of this inflectional element and the character of this head determine what kind of case is assigned. Now, in a minimalist theory, this can mean only one thing. It can mean that the tense raises to here and the verb raises to here. Notice those are the same operation. Structurally, they're the same operation. And once they do, they form the adjunction structure, agra, and then its head. I'm assuming normal adjunction theory. This is the head. And then over here, there'll be either tense or verb, whichever is the one that raised. And the specifier of that thing, this is still a head, but now a complex head formed by head adjunction. The specifier of that head will get either nominative case or accusative case or something else, depending on the character of these. Okay, so that would be, and the difference between case and agreement is only what is the structure of the relevant part of the inflectional element. Is the structure of the relevant part only this, or is it the whole complex? If it's only this, we call it agreement. If it's the whole complex, we call it case. Okay, but those are just names for structural, very general structural relations. So we're sort of forced to that, and then we have a unified and still very minimalist theory, only keeping to the most minimal and unchallengeable facts, no complicated empirical facts. Notice that at once a very tricky question arises. A question arises since there's very few assumptions here. We're not assuming anything. We have no mechanisms around to describe anything. There's no ways of forcing things to come out the right way. They've got to come out the right way on extremely elementary assumptions. So we face big problems that you usually don't have to face. Like one problem we face is, why does the subject go up to here while the object goes up to here? Now, how come the object doesn't get nominative case and the subject get accusative case? In fact, that's kind of what you'd expect, because the usual patterns in language are nesting patterns, not crossing patterns. In fact, there are many theories around which require that you have nesting, not crossing patterns. But in fact, if the verb phrase internal subject theory is correct, and if this kind of big case theory, unified case theory is correct, then what you get is crossing patterns, and you can't get nesting patterns. So that requires an explanation. And in fact, the answer to that question turns out to be quite interesting. It relates a whole pile of things, including conditions on object raising and aspects of government transparency, Carley of Baker, and so on and so forth. But it turns out there is a very natural explanation for this. Unfortunately, I can't go into it. Sorry. But that's the kind of problem that will arise. It just take a little too much mechanism. But without any further assumptions, really, virtually no further assumptions, this comes out along with a bunch of other things. Anyway, that's the kind of problem that would arise. Well, in a minimalist program of this kind, one thing you'll have to do if you want to eliminate head government, as one should from this point of view, because it's not conceptually necessary, is to try to unify case, structural case, and this would be the way to do it. Well, what about small pro? Here too the same problem arises. Let's assume for concreteness, say, Rizzi's theory of small pro. This has two aspects, remember. According to his theory, small pro is licensed in part by a spec-head relation, namely a relation to a certain type of agreement. Okay. Incidentally, I should say that these terms, agra O and agra S, are just mnemonics. They don't mean anything. These are the same element, right? Exactly the same element. I just use S and O to remind you of where they stand in the structure. But they're each just the collection of phi features. They may be different collections of phi features and other things. Agra may have other properties. In fact, I'll come back to them. But it's at least a collection of phi features. Okay, and it's not S and O are like specifier and complement. Those are just names of positions and structures. Just to keep it in mind, really, it's a mnemonic. Let's take small pro. According to Rizzi's theory, the subject small pro is licensed by this relation, where this is a strong enough inflection, and in this theory it's going to be a strong enough agra. And then there's object small pro, which in his theory is licensed by head government, but incidentally only by this case of head government, never by exceptional case marking, and that's a sort of strong enough verb. Strong enough verb allows empty object. You get a paper on this around 1986 in LI. So there's two kinds of small pro, and if we want to get rid of head government, we're going to have to get rid of the second case. And notice here it's particularly well motivated because there never is the equivalent of exceptional case marking, and there's the obvious way to do it. The obvious way to do it is to say that the licensing of small pro is always by the spec head relation, and it's either by and it's always strong enough agra, and the strong enough agra may be inherent, or it may require beefing up by the right kind of verb after a junction, but that will give you the context for pro licensing, unified context. So that works out about the way you want. What about capital pro? Actually, that's interesting, but according to this point of view, you should treat it the same way, and that really works out surprisingly well with a kind of, the case is just a relationship, so it's always going to exist, even if it's unmarked, and that means it could very well be what you might call a null case, just never sounded, and that case will be the case where nothing sounded, but the relationship exists, and I think it's pretty good reason to believe that that's what we call capital pro, and then a lot of other things follow. I'll just mention that. Well, the structure of this thing is very largely forced on you. You haven't got a lot of choices. In fact, probably no choices if you think it through. The C-I relationship, I is now, this is now agra, double bar, right? That relationship is forced by the nature of clauses. They have force indicators and propositions, so nothing to say about that. Internal to the IP, there's got to be at least as many agras as there are noun phrases down here that are going to require whatever the equivalent of the case filter turns out to be in this system. So the case filter, just taking it to be a phenomenal notion, cases have to be somehow assigned. If there's two noun phrases down here that are going to satisfy the case filter, since the only way you can satisfy the case filter is by being the spec of an agra, there got to be two agras. Okay, so like say a transitive verb, there'll have to be two agras. You're forced, and the general principles of movement, if you think them through, are going to force them to look like this. In fact, that's about the only thing that would unify the raising of T to agra and D to agra, which bring together the two major parts of case theory. So basically the whole system's forced. That is, UG wouldn't have to say anything about this. It just sort of comes out that way. There's no other way for things to work. So it looks like a specific structure, but it follows from extremely weak, in fact virtually no assumptions other than ones one is forced to make. Notice further that suppose that's in the case of, suppose you have only one noun phrase down here that requires case. Well, then the theory of language permits two options. That one noun phrase, like the subject of an intransitive verb, intransitive in the sense of unergative, the subject of an intransitive verb could either be picking up its case from this agra or from that agra. Well, there's two possible logical possibilities, and that suggests there ought to be two different types of language. Ones in which this one is, let's call it the active one, and this one's inert, and where this one's the active one and that one's inert. In the ones where, if suppose we pick this to be the active, so that's got to be an option that languages settle. They can be two types of languages with exactly two types with regard to case theory. Suppose that a language picks this one, that's the active one, and this is the inert one. Only works in the default case when you got two noun phrases that need it. Well, in that case, the subject of an intransitive verb is going to look like the subject of a transitive verb. Okay, that's what we call a nominative accusative language. Suppose you pick this one, that's the other possibility. Well, then the subject of an intransitive verb will look like the object of a transitive verb. That's what we call an ergative absolutive language. And those are the only two possibilities, and it's interesting that those are the two possibilities that exist, apparently, and there couldn't be anything else from this point of view, and you should have just these. So you get a kind of a unified approach to the general problems of case theory. The apparent split between two types looks like just kind of like a triviality, depending on how you set the parameter as to which of these two things is inert. You got to set it one way or the other. You could have a mixed language if different verbs do it different ways. Let's say that would be mixed ergativity and so on, and that's all there ought to be. Well, so far we're. What about more than two arguments? Suppose there's more than two NPs down here. Well, there may be reasons to believe that that can't exist, but let's put that aside. If it can't exist, you're stuck with this. That's the only possible form of the theta theoretic reasons, basically, for saying that that's the only kind of thing that could exist. If that's true, then and I think there's some reason to believe it, to pursue that would move on to considerations of the kind that Larson and Hale Kaiser and other people have investigated about multiple argument structures. Just indicates direction. I can't explain what that means. If so, then we would be forced to this by very general assumptions, all within the domain of something close to conceptual necessity. Well, so far I haven't brought up any complicated facts, only kind of trivial, elementary facts. And I want to try to keep to that. Arguments, conceptual arguments are much more persuasive if they're based on non-tricky facts. If you bring up complicated, tricky facts, there's always a lot of ways of dealing with them. So let's see how far we can go by just extremely elementary, simple facts. Notice that the facts are not phenomenal facts. Like the case feature isn't a phenomenal fact. The case filter is not a phenomenal fact. It's an abstract interpretation of certain phenomenal facts, but still looks extremely well-grounded. We have to explain what it means precisely, but the phenomena are pretty well-grounded. Okay, now let's proceed. Let's take a look back at the EST, extended standard theory in any of its variants. And for concreteness here, I'll take the version in my own lectures on government and binding, which sort of lays out a principles and parameters theory, brings together a lot of work of different people and expresses that view. In that framework, LGB and more or less everything that follows from it or is related to it, and almost anything else, there is other structure postulated. One thing I've already mentioned, head government. I'm trying to get rid of that. But there's plenty of other structure postulated, and we have to ask about that other structure. Well, one thing that's postulated, notice that I said before that it's within the domain of conceptual necessity, you are forced to have some kind of an operation which selects elements from the lexicon and presents them in a form accessible to the computational system, which means maps them onto X-bar structures. That's required. Let's give it a name and call it the operation satisfy. Okay, so you have to have some operation satisfy. It's always presupposed. Nobody bothers to spell it out, but let's spell it out. An operation which says, let's pick an array of elements from the lexicon. We pick a bunch of words or something like whatever the minimal things are, and we present them in an X-bar theoretic form. So satisfy picks this array and turns it into an X-bar projection. Now, in EST systems, this thing is what's called D-structure. And notice that it has a striking property which is not forced by conceptual necessity. Namely, it's what you might call an all-at-once operation. By that I mean that the way the operation is conceived, you pick a bunch of things out of the lexicon and you give a representation of them in totality as one structure. Okay, now that's always been assumed, but notice it is an assumption. Okay, and it's an assumption that goes beyond conceptual necessity, so we might therefore want to question it. In fact, we will have to question it if we want to keep to the idea that the only levels are the interface levels, because D structure plainly isn't an interface level. It's you might call it an internal interface level. It relates the computational system and the lexicon, but has nothing to do with instructions for the use of language. Okay, so it's already well beyond the domain of conceptual necessity. It's an extra level, requires empirical justification. Let's ask, and it has empirical justification, but let's ask whether it's strong enough to bear the weight. Well, there are a number of problems with it, if you think it through. One problem has to do with this notion of an array. What is an array? I purposely didn't say set. Sets are understandable. We can't just start with a set of lexical items and convert them into a D structure, because the trouble is that the same set of lexical items may be different D structures depending on how you organize them. So we have some other note, like John hit Bill and Bill hit John, have the same selection of lexical items, but they're different D structures. So we have some other notion in mind, array, whatever that may be. And the problem of explaining that is not so trivial. So that's problem number one. What's an array? Problem number two has to do with the fact that in all of these theories, D structure somehow has to match LF. There's got to be some condition that says that D structure expresses the same relationships that LF expresses. There are various ways of working that out. One way of working it out is, in fact, the usual way that's accepted is the projection principle and the theta criterion. Okay? These notions, they were separating the sheep from the goats. These notions, which again I'm going to assume you know, are, if you think about what their nature is, what's the nature of these principles? Well, their nature is to assure a certain relationship between D structure and LF. That's their nature. That's what they're there for. Now, in fact, they have some empirical consequences. They're not just conceptual. For example, one empirical consequence is that they block raising to theta positions. It's an important empirical consequence. We want to make sure we save that somehow. And they have other empirical consequences. But their basic motivation is conceptual. Namely, they assure that D structure and LF look alike in the right way. You don't have one head-complement relationship in D structure and a different one at LF. That would be incoherent, right? So we have these principles that are required in order to ensure the conformity of those systems. And that principle raises various questions. Both of these principles raise various questions if you think about them. Notice that at the LF level, these principles are trivial, in fact superfluous. You don't have to state them at the LF level. If at the LF level you don't satisfy the theta criterion, you just have gibberish. Okay? But there's nothing wrong with gibberish. You know, the generative procedure should certainly be able to generate gibberish. We can interpret it. And you can have gibberish can come about in a lot of different ways. I mean, endless number of ways in which you can get gibberish. Each of them has its own interpretation, it's its own kind of gibberish. One kind of gibberish will be violating the theta criterion, like you got a argument around and then a theta roll. Okay, that's one kind of gibberish. Similarly, the projection principle doesn't really mean anything at LF. You don't have a representation at LF unless it satisfies, unless everything's in a place, but that's just the projection principle. So at LF, these principles are essentially unnecessary. We could throw them out. And at D structure, they're required primarily to make the picture coherent, which makes it kind of dubious. They do have some empirical consequences, but if we could take care of the empirical consequences in some other way, we could eliminate the projection principle and the theta criterion and D structure, all of them, and we would then be much closer to saying that we have only interface representations. Okay, so let's see if so that would be the task. And let me just finally add a third problem. This is sort of conceptual. A third problem is straight empirical. There have always been known some very serious problems with the idea that D structure exists. And these problems were always noted but put to the side, figuring to take care of them someday. But let's take a look at them now that we're questioning. One of them is discussed in LGB, in fact, and it has to do with the complex adjectival constructions, you know, the John is easy to please type and that whole mass of stuff. In the last chapter of LGB, in the section on residual problems, it's pointed out that that kind of structure shouldn't exist according to the theory that is presented there. And there's a sort of a deep reason why it shouldn't exist. The deep reason is that this is a non-theta position, a position that can have expletives. On the other hand, there's extremely strong reason to assume that that's not raising. Okay? A lot of empirical evidence that that's not raising, that in fact whatever raising there is going on in here, and that this is off somewhere else, but it's a non-theta position, and therefore it's impossible. So it's ruled out on very general grounds. Well, there's a kind of an answer to that proposed in LGB. The answer says that this is not an acceptable D structure. It violates the projection principle and theta criterion. So the assumption there is, well, at the D structure level, you have an empty position here, and you have lexical access in the course of the derivation, which introduces this thing. Okay? Well, that's consistent with the technology, but it's not consistent with the driving intuitions, and that'll always make you worry. You know, I mean, you can make a lot of things that work. You know, you want to be an engineer, you can get things that work, but you want to ensure that they're really consistent with the intuitions that are, you know, the principles that are driving the system. And this, though it works, is not consistent with those principles. The principles are that D structure is supposed to reflect the lexical array. That's the principle. You know, you can jiggle things around so you get around it, but whenever you do that, you should have a warning flag up. Now, in fact, that apart, this method doesn't work anyway, as was pointed out almost instantly, I think probably first by Howard Lasnik. And the problem is that the thing that you insert here is not necessarily a lexical item. It can be a phrase of any complexity. For example, it could be a phrase that includes a structure of this kind. You know, you could have, you know, the fact that Bill is hard to please, you know, the person who is hard to please is easy to please. Okay, in which you've inserted something which has that very structure inside it. So now what are you going to do? You look like you're off in a regress. So the empirical problem is real, and it's been hanging around for about 10 years. And there's an obvious answer to it. And the answer was also recognized at once. The answer is to abandon the whole story and go back to the 1950s and use generalized transformations. If you go back to, say, logical structure of linguistic theory, and you have generalized transformations, then it's easy. You have one, you know, kind of computation that's generating what's ever in here, and you have one computation which is generating what's ever over there, and at some point a generalized transformation sticks them together, and you go home free. Of course, if you do that, you've abandoned the notion of D-structure. There wasn't any conception of D-structure in LSLT. There's some other kind of notion. Well, that was recognized a long time ago and put to the side. Okay, so looking at this bunch of problems, the immediate suggestion that comes to mind is, okay, let's bite the bullet, throw out D-structure, throw out the projection principle and the theta criterion, keep to conceptual necessity, to the minimalist program, and just allow generalized transformations. Well, can we do that in a plausible way? That's going to mean that we drop the idea that satisfy is an all-at-once operation. Okay, there is going to be no level of representation that reflects the array of lexical choices. Hence, we drop the notion of array. We don't have to worry about that. We lose the conceptual problems, and we lose the empirical problems. So that's fine. And we keep to the minimalist program. Of course, you have to show that the empirical consequences still come out, right? Because otherwise, you're in trouble. There were reasons for doing this. And that's the task. Well, how can we proceed in such a way that the assumptions are really minimalist, the least possible thing? Well, let's now construct a new theory which eliminates the all-at-once assumption and goes like this. We still have the operation satisfied because that's conceptual necessity. You've got to pick items and turn them into X-bar structures, but we drop the all-at-once requirement. So satisfy picks an element out of the lexicon. That's easy. Just picks a single thing out of the lexicon. Okay, and it forms an X-bar theoretic structure from it. Well, what are the X-bar theoretic structures it can form? Well, there's only three. It can form this one. That's alpha 0. It can form this one. Let's just write it like that. Or it can form this one. Those are the only possibilities, right? That's the minimal X-bar theoretic structures, and that will be the residue of the projection principle. Very trivial. It says the projection principle just picks an item from the lexicon and presents it in one of the conceivable ways. Okay, period. That's step 1 and 2 of satisfied. And now we're finished with that. Okay, we dropped the all-at-once requirement, no D-structure. Now proceed, we do this in as many different ways as we like, right? Like we do lots of different computations, as many as we feel like, all starting like this. We have the usual singularity transformations, which in fact are just going to reduce to move alpha. But now we allow ourselves a generalized transformation. Generalized transformation works like this, kind of like LSLT. It takes a phrase marker, let's call it K, and it targets it. And it takes another phrase marker, let's call it K prime. And K prime has to have the property that it has an empty position in it. So let's call it that. Finds K prime with an empty position in it. And what the generalized transformation does is take a look at these two guys, and it forms a new phrase marker, K star, which is K prime K. That is, it takes K and sticks it in the empty position in K prime. Okay? That's generalized transformation. What, incidentally, is a singularity transformation? A singularity transformation is something that targets K again, but K itself has an empty position in it. I'm now talking about substitution. I'll come back to adjunction in a moment. And it forms K star, which equals K with some element, alpha, in the place of 0, where alpha has come out of K itself, like raising. Okay? So that's a singularity transformation. That's a generalized transformation. Okay, that's sort of the least that you can say. Suppose, and so now that's the whole theory. So that's the theory of computation. Theory of computation says there's a generalized transformation and there's a singularity transformation. They both have the same property in effect. Something singularity, if it pulls something out of the phrase marker it targets and puts it in the empty position, it's generalized if it takes another phrase marker and sticks it in the empty position. Now, if you look a little more closely at this, you notice something else. The element 0 is not in the lexicon. Lexicon is an array of lexical elements. 0 isn't in there. Therefore, you can't have a phrase marker with a 0 in it. Now, what that means is that the transformation itself must be inserting the 0. Okay, so and that's true of both of these operations. Both the generalized and the singularity transformation must actually be inserting the 0 in the targeted phrase marker. Okay, so the actual operation, any operation, is going to take some phrase marker. It's going to add a 0 to it. We'll have to explain how when that becomes important. And then it'll do this. It'll substitute something for that 0. Now notice what that means. That means that when you're looking at I've now gone into the internal mechanisms of a single operation. Everything I've just said about the 0 and so on is something that's never visible. Like if you're scanning the steps of a derivation, you never see 0 at all. 0 is something that happened in between the two steps of the derivation. It's kind of as if you're looking at a proof in formalized arithmetic, and you have a step here and a step here, and there was a proof up here. And if you actually look at what's going on, there's an awful lot of stuff going on from here to here. Like if you're doing modus ponens, you had some operation that went back there and found some guy and had that and compared them and did all sorts of things. But that's all like the programmer's algorithm that's carrying you from one step to another. In terms of the brain sciences, it's the internal machinery of the brain, way below subliminal. You know, it's kind of like when you do move alpha, you move something from here to here. Well, you know, first you moved it this far, but you never see the first half of the arrow. You know, that's something subliminal. It's got to be going on if it's a real operation, but you don't see it. Okay, and what I just described is like that. From the point of view of scanning the steps of a derivation, this is, you don't see it, so you never see 0. What you see is just successive steps, one of which in a singularity transformation is k, and the next one is k star, and in the case of a generalized transformation, it was k and k prime, and it ended up with k star. Okay, and the way it happened is the way I just described. Well, now to finish up the programming, how does the 0 get inserted? Okay, well, the most elementary assumption, the easiest assumption, so let's assume it's true, pursuing the same course, you know, we're God designing the language. The easiest assumption would be to say that the way you add 0 is you don't tamper with k at all. You just tack 0 onto it. Okay, so you don't have to bother going in. If you start getting inside k, you got a lot of problems. You know, where do I go? You know, where do I put it, and so on. So let's say God is simple-minded, and he says, well, the way you do it is you take k, or k prime in this case, the thing you're targeting, and you just tack 0 onto it. Okay, that's the only thing you're allowed to do. Okay, that's the simplest possible thing, so let's assume it's true. And we now have the following story. A singularity transformation or a binary transformation, a generalized one, work the same way. They take some phrase marker, they add something onto it. The end result of this adding on, again, must satisfy X bar theory, because that's the general condition on representations. If you don't, then you're blocked, finished. You know, computational system doesn't know how to proceed if it's just getting the wrong thing. So automatically this thing has to satisfy X bar theory, or else the thing stops, computation stops, you know, a red flag goes up or something. And the way it does it is the simplest possible way. Just tack something on, doesn't interfere with what's inside. Okay? Now, let's finish up the story. Remember, we start the computation, just we pick something out of the lexicon, we apply satisfy. We then maybe pick something else out of the lexicon, or maybe we go on with singularity transformations here, or, you know, we just do what we feel like, and maybe stick a couple of these together with generalized transformations, and then do some more singularity transformations, and it's all free, nothing more said. This is the totality of operations. So we do anything that's allowed. At some point in this course, when we get down to a single phrase marker, we have choices. Here's the last story. We have the choice of just going on with more singularity transformations, or maybe tacking something else onto it by going back to the lexicon. Or we have the choice of applying a rule, which let's call spell out. And spell out transfers you over to the PF component. Okay. And then you sort of spell it out. You know, you apply the PF rules, and out comes a phonetic form. And meanwhile, you keep computing down here. Keep going, but only with one condition. You're not allowed any further lexical access. Okay. I mean, that's obvious. Once you've pronounced the thing, you can't add another word to the meaning, right? Like you can't say John left and mean John left England. Okay, so that trivial statement says that once you've applied spell out, you continue to compute in a perfectly mechanical fashion, but now using only singularity transformations and whatever other LF operations there may be with no more lexical access and no generalized transformations. Okay, that's the whole theory. Okay, let's assume that that's the whole theory of computation. We still have to define the notion of optimality, but having defined it, if we can do it, we will then be able to say, maybe crazily, but we'll be able to say that a linguistic expression is the optimal realization of interface conditions on the interface. Notice the effect of this elementary assumption that the way to add 0 is not to interfere with the internal structure of K. That has some strong consequences, very strong consequences. For one thing, it entails a certain version of the strict cycle condition. It says that you can't insert things in a structure you've already passed. And notice that it gives you a form of the strict cycle condition which is required by the most elementary considerations, no sophisticated arguments. In fact, if you were allowed to do the more complex thing and insert inside the phrase marker, you would lose all cases of ECP that fall under what Ricci calls the relativized minimality category. Let's just think what you could do. Suppose you want to try super raising, let's say. You want to go from, you want to get the sentence, John seems that it is certain, to be happy or something like that, where you went all the way from here to here. Notice what you could do if you were allowed to insert 0. You could construct the whole expression minus that. Okay, you just didn't insert this position yet. And then you could raise, and that's fine. It doesn't violate ECP or relativized minimality. And then later on, you insert something in here, because you're allowed now, by assumption, to assert internally. Well, you've lost super raising. Same with all the other cases. So on the most elementary conditions, we want assumptions. We want that version of the strict cycle. And that's the only version we want on elementary considerations. And we get that on very simple grounds. You're not allowed to tamper with the thing targeted. You can only attach something to it. What kind of thing can you do? Well, the kinds of things you can do are things like this. Suppose you've got a phrase marker that, say, looks, for example, like this. V bar, V, ZP. You've already built this one up with all of its internal parts. The internal parts of ZP and of V. And now you want to apply it, you want to do a transformation to this. Well, one thing you're allowed to do is tack 0 on here. And remember, the thing that you're constructing has to satisfy X bar theory, which means that this has got to be V double bar. There's nothing else that's going to be satisfying X bar theory. So you can construct that. And then you can replace this by something, and what you replace it by could, for example, be something in here, or it could be another phrase marker. But whatever it is, it's going to have to be an XP, an XP, maximal projection, or otherwise you violate X bar theory again. Okay, so you could, let's say, raise to, this could be any hit at all. You could raise to the subject position, or you could insert something in the subject position, for example. That's the kind of thing you could do. But the kind of thing you can't do is insert anything internally. So in particular, if you have this structure, one thing that you can't do is insert something in here. Okay, it means you can't get a triple branching structure, because that would violate the principle. So you're forced to have only binary structures. Okay, so we get the simplest assumption about the operation of transformations forces the strict cycle in exactly the sense you want, no fancy arguments, and it eliminates the possibility of multiple branching. Notice that also means you also couldn't have done this. Suppose you had this element, just that, and you tried to stick in a complement. Couldn't do that either, because that's going inside the structure. That has the effect of saying you can't either raise or substitute in a complement position, in a theta position. So that was the biggest consequence of the projection principle. So we got that. Okay. The main consequence of the projection principle falls out of very weak assumptions. You can't substitute in theta positions. And in fact, it's much broader than that, but that's one case. And you're forced to have strict binarity. You don't have to stipulate it. There's just no other way for structures to exist. Okay, so what we're really saying about X bar theory is just this. We weren't saying anything about binary structures. We're just saying, well, we say of X bar theory, you got 3 levels, period. Everything else follows. Okay. Okay, let's proceed. So far I've only been talking about substitution. We're obviously going to have to say something about adjunction. And what we say will be obvious. We allow ourselves another couple more schemata. And in fact, we'll allow ourselves these schemata. Adjunction to xp and this schema. Adjunction to x0. And we'll do it exactly the same way as before. Okay. Stick in a 0 over here. And then either raise or substitute. And you've got to put in the right thing or you violate X bar theory and everything stops. Now, notice in the case of adjunction, there's never going to be an argument for the strict cycle. The kind of relativized minimality argument that I gave before isn't going to arise for adjunction. So therefore, there's no reason to assume in the case of adjunction that you can't go inside the phrase marker. In fact, we don't need the 0 at all. We can just say there's an adjunction operation that takes something and adjoins it here, and or raises and adjoins it here, period. Hence, no strict cycle. Also, no problems about not moving into theta positions and so on. That restricts the strict cycle to substitution in overt syntax. Okay. Do we want to restrict do we want to extend the strict cycle to substitution in LF syntax? Well, that becomes a very subtle question. Notice that the arguments that I gave before won't work. Since you have no lexical access in LF syntax, you're never going to violate ECP if you violate the cycle. So that argument collapses. And then it becomes pretty subtle as to whether you want the consequences or not. Now, there's some very subtle considerations. They, in fact, have to do with this ensuring that you get crossing rather than nesting and things like that, but I'm going to put that aside. Just notice this question. Anyhow, I think the right answer is that the strict cycle, that is the notion that you add on at the outside, is probably just a property of substitution overt syntax, nothing else. Overt syntax meaning what happens before spell out PF. Okay. Well, we've now eliminated D structure with all of its problems, eliminated the projection principle, eliminated the theta criterion, still within the minimalist assumptions. We now have 2 operations instead of 1, but they work the same way. One of them, and the way I described, and out of it falls the strict cycle on natural assumptions. What about S structure? That's the next level that isn't required by conceptual necessity. Well, with regard to S structure, there's basically 2 kinds of evidence. I don't know how far I'm going to get, but we'll just keep going. There's 2 kinds of evidence with regard to S structure. One kind of evidence has to do with what you might call the point of spell out, the point at which it applies. Now that has to do with things like, do you apply spell out before verb raising to inflection or after verb raising to inflection? Okay, so that's the difference between, say, French type and English type languages. In French type languages, you raise the verb before you spell it out. In English type languages, you don't raise the verb before you spell it out. That kind of thing that Emmons and Pluck and others talk about. So things like verb raising are relevant. And there just do seem to be parametric differences there. So it looks as though that's one of the reasons for S structure is that you can say things like that. You can say you've got to raise the verb before S structure or after S structure. Okay, that's one of the reasons for having S structure. Another kind of thing has to do with WH and C2. So if you're Chinese-Japanese, you let the thing sit down there until after S structure. If you're English, you move it before S structure. That's a point of spell-out argument. Second category of arguments about S structure have to do with the conditions at the particular modules of the modules. So like binding theory and case theory and so on. Okay? In fact, if you look at the literature, you'll notice that every module has very strong arguments to make it an S structure condition. And if so, then S structure must exist. Okay? And that's the second category of arguments. Well, if we want to show that we have, this God-designed minimalist theory, we have to show that all of these arguments are wrong, despite their overwhelming empirical support. Okay? We have to show that it's wrong to assume that the point of spell out has to be determined by S structure, and it's wrong to assume that the conditions hold at S structure. So let's proceed with that task. Actually, I think this can be done, in fact, very convincingly, but I'll just give you some examples. Well, suppose there's no S structure, okay? Then let's take the first kind, the deeper kind in a way. So if there's no S structure, there can't be any conditions on point of spell out. You can't make the usual statement about French type and English type languages or Japanese type and English type languages. That's unstatable. Okay. So what are you left with? Well, the only levels that we have are the interface levels, PF and LF. So and since there are parametric differences, like English is just different from Japanese and French is different from English, we're going to have to state those parametric differences at either the PF level or the LF level. We're sort of forced to that. Now, it's impossible. We can rule out the LF level immediately. Parametric differences are essentially unstatable at the LF level on learnability grounds, general grounds. Since a person acquiring a language hasn't the foggiest idea what's going on in the LF level, there can't be differences among languages there. LF has got to be reflex, because you have no evidence about it. Okay, so therefore we've eliminated the LF level, and therefore it turns out that the differences of point of spell out have to be statable at the PF level. Okay, so there must be some property of the PF level that determines the point of spell out. Furthermore, if it's true, the general picture is true, that the parametric differences among languages are restricted to a few properties of functional elements, then it must be something about functional elements at the PF level, at the level of pure phonetic transcription. Remember, the PF level has no structure, it's just a phonetic matrix. So there must be something about morphological elements at the PF level that's telling you the point of spell out. We're forced to that conclusion. I mean, the logic of the situation is that can be the only possible answer. So let's assume that it works. I'll come back to it in a second. But just put it aside and notice that's got to be the answer or the whole program goes. Let's turn now to the second type. I'll come back to it in a second. But first let's turn to the second type of condition. Here we have to give an argument against any S-structure condition, say binding theory. Okay, got to show that it's wrong despite the evidence. Now, such an argument could be of varying degrees of strength. So the weakest form of argument, let's say, suppose we're talking about condition C in binding theory, the weakest form of argument would be to say it can apply at LF. Notice that's really enough. If we can show it can apply at LF, we have shown that it does apply at LF. The reason is that LF is forced on us by conceptual necessity and S-structure isn't. Okay? So that's enough of an argument, actually. Right? The level that must, if we can show the level that must be there suffices, we've eliminated any claim. We've established the null hypothesis. We've eliminated any claim for S-structure. A stronger argument would be, furthermore, not only can it apply at LF, sometimes it must apply at LF. Okay? If we can show that sometimes it must apply at LF and it always can apply at LF, then we have an even stronger argument that it always applies at LF, namely just by the assumption of unitary character. We obviously want the conditions to apply at one level rather than many levels. Okay? So that's a stronger argument. And the strongest possible argument would be, furthermore, it can't apply at S-structure, or else things go haywire, and that's decisive. Okay, if we can show the stronger argument, then we've killed it. But even the weakest argument suffices, notice. Well, I think you can get all three, including the third, for most cases. And let me I really just have to give a couple of examples, because this really now proliferates into a huge story. But just to indicate the kind of thing that one would try to do, let's take some of the standard arguments that are strong, in fact. So take, say, the standard argument. Let's take, say, condition C of binding theory. There's a standard. I'll erase this. There's a standard argument that in the literature that says it's got to apply at S-structure. Okay, and the argument comes from multiple WH questions, for example. So take the sentence. You said he liked the pictures that John took and compare it with, suppose we question this, which pictures that John took did you say he liked? And then we consider the multiple WH question. Who said he liked which pictures that John took? Okay, take that paradigm. Here's the standard argument. I assume you know this. In the first case, we have a condition C violation, so he isn't John. In the second case, we obviate the condition C violation at S structure because we've lost C command. Now, crucially, we look at the third case, and we ask, does this behave like case 1 or case 2? Well, remember that this thing is moving up to here at LF. So if the condition holds at LF, this ought to behave like this. If the condition holds at S structure, this ought to behave like that. In fact, it behaves like that. We have therefore demonstrated that condition C, the binding theory, holds at S structure. Okay, that's the standard argument. It's convincing, on one assumption. And let's ask about the assumption. The assumption is that this entire phrase moves up to here. Well, what evidence do we have for that? Actually, there is some, but if you think about it, we haven't got a lot of evidence for it. We never hear it. This is mental computation, which is after spell out, right? So we never hear it. In fact, suppose we assume that something else is going on. That let's make. You said he likes. Let's make this many pictures, and how many pictures, just for plausibility and easiness. But the same was true of the example I gave. Suppose we say that what's going on here is that just this part is moving up. Okay, just the operator itself is moving up, not the restriction on the operator. Okay, suppose the LF operation is viewed differently. Only the operator is moving up to the WH phrase, not the whole phrase. Okay. Well, we can't hear that that's wrong because we don't hear anything. Notice that if it's right, then we have what's called reconstruction, but we haven't done reconstruction. There's a whole big story about reconstruction. We essentially have it, but without saying anything about reconstruction, which is a good idea because it's a crazy operation. And what we've said is that just the quantifier moves to the other quantifier. Okay. Now, notice you can't do this overtly. I mean, everybody knows you can't raise out of here. So we seem to be in the unpleasant situation of saying that you can have LF operations that aren't overt operations. However, that's probably the wrong way of looking at it because something else is known about these things. What's known about these things is that in multiple WH constructions, the downstairs WH phrase doesn't violate all conditions on movement. It violates ECP, it violates that trace filter, it violates everything. And that's been a huge problem in the technology of all the theories. You look at Lasnik-Saito or anybody else, and they got all kinds of complicated mechanisms to deal with this fact. Well, suppose we, again, bite the bullet and say that what's going on is this isn't LF movement at all. What it is in fact absorption. What May and Higginbotham call absorption. That is, it is just establishing a relationship between two quantifiers and giving one of them the scope of the other and forming a generalized quantifier out of them. That's it. There wasn't any movement. Therefore, of course, it violates all movement conditions like ECP. And furthermore, we never raised this thing, so of course it behaves like that because that's what it looks like at LF. So we've knocked out the requirement, the condition, the requirement that it apply at S structure. Notice this is an argument of the weakest type. It says the operation can apply at LF. Now we can say condition C applies at LF. Okay, usually the way people say this is, well, you had reconstruction, but we didn't introduce any of that stuff. We just say the operation is in fact absorption. It was a mistake to think of it as WH movement. Now, that's the best possible hypothesis. There's always been a strong argument against it. Which is the reason why it wasn't pursued. The strong argument against it has to do with the Japanese-Chinese type languages, where you have LF, WH, and C2. But we know, since Huang's work about 10 years ago, that the WH and C2 satisfy some, though not all, LF operations, overt operations. Like the WH and C2 in Chinese does satisfy ECP. Okay. On the other hand, if this is correct, it shouldn't satisfy anything. That ought to be the same operation, notice. In English, it's multiple WH, and Japanese or Chinese or Korean or any of those languages, just a single WH. Okay. And that looks like an overwhelming argument against proceeding this way. Now, in fact, there's a recent paper by Akira Watanabe who overcomes this objection, I think. What he claims, and he gives an interesting argument, evidence for it, is that in Japanese and Chinese, and that class of languages, there is also overt movement, but it's overt movement of an empty operator. Okay? And that overt movement of the empty operator is what is yielding all the effects, all the ECP effects. Then there is an operation of LF movement which brings that thing down below and tacks it on to the overt, to the empty operator, like complex adjectives and so on. He has some quite interesting evidence for this, subtle but interesting, and the facts look right. Now, if that's the case, we've killed the counter-argument. It's going to turn out that there aren't any WH and C2 languages. They don't exist according to this. They just appear to exist because, we only are stuck with phenomena. We don't see what's really going on. What's really going on is they all have overt movement. The overt movement always meets the syntactic conditions. Then you have the thing, he calls it LF movement, but I would prefer to say not at all. It's just absorption, which relates the two pieces, or relates the two quantifiers, forms a generalized quantifier if there's two of them, a singular quantifier if there's one of them, and that's it. And the second operation doesn't meet any conditions at all. Okay, so that would obviate the standard objection to this. We now have, assuming that this path can be pursued, we'll have knocked out one argument for S-structure conditions, hence for the existence of S-structures. Well, let's turn now. I still got some patience, a lot more one can talk about. Should I go on a little bit? Yeah. Let's turn now to, I haven't yet said anything about optimality, so let's say something about that. And then I'll come back to things like point of spell out, V-raising, and so on. What kind of optimality do we want? Well, let's take the cases that are obvious. So there's one case. Let's begin with optimality of representation. Okay. Now, it turns out that in the whole history of the field, there have been certain assumptions about this which have been tacit, and now let's make them overt. The assumptions that have been tacit have to do with the PF component, okay, which is somehow less controversial to people, I guess, because you can hear it. We have this prejudice about phenomena, which we have to get over. But at the PF level, there have always been some tacit assumptions about optimality of representation, and let's think what they are. The assumption has always been, the PF level, you have just a phonetic matrix, right? No structure, no words, no brackets, nothing like that. It's just instructions to the sensory motor system, okay? It's always been assumed that at the PF level in a phonetic representation, there's no superfluous symbols around. So, for example, if somebody gave you did a phonetic analysis of a language which had in it some symbol that you got to get rid of somehow, you'd say, no, wait a minute, you didn't get to the phonetic level yet. The phonetic level doesn't have that property. The phonetic level has the property that every symbol there is, let's call it a legitimate PF object. It's an object that has a uniform, language-independent, universal interpretation apart from this language, okay? Like it could be this, for example. You could have a phonetic representation that looks like that, but nothing that you got to do any more work on. The further work that's done on it has to be language independent, otherwise this isn't an instruction at the interface. That's always been assumed, taken for granted. So, for example, and there are a lot of crazy things you're not allowed to have at the PF level. I mean, they're so crazy nobody thinks about them. But, for example, if you ended up with, say, a vowel that's plus high and plus low, people would tell you, wait a minute, you screwed up somewhere. The output can't look like that. Or if you had, say, a stressed consonant or something like that, they'd say you screwed up somewhere. Because that just doesn't meet the conditions on PF representation. Well, if you think about what's going on here, what's always been tacitly assumed that there is some notion of legitimate PF object, and it's maybe IPA or whatever your universal phonetics happens to be, and exactly if a representation is constituted of such objects and nothing else, then it satisfies the interface condition. This is what I've been calling lately the principle of full interpretation. Namely, every symbol at the interface level must have a language-independent universal interpretation at the interface, reflecting properties of the interface, period. if a derivation has the property that it ends up with a PF representation meeting full interpretation, let's say the derivation converges at PF, meaning the derivation worked at PF. It gave you something that worked out at PF. If it doesn't have that property, let's say it crashes at PF, just to have a way of talking. Okay, so if it ends up with a stress consonant or some crazy thing that you can't get an interpretation for, it crashed. If it didn't, it converged. Now notice so far I've just stated assumptions which are tacit. I mean, everybody accepts them. We nobody bothers saying them because they're so obvious, but let's say them. The reason for saying them is that they ought to apply at LF too, and there they're not so obvious. LF is the level that's tricky because you don't see anything, but it ought to work exactly the way PF works. Okay, so now that we've stated the assumptions, let's see what happens at LF. Well, yeah. Just says here's the phonetic matrix. The thing that you get, like P, H, and so on. The principle of full interpretation says this thing is completely constituted out of entities. Let's say alpha is one of them. And if alpha is if it's constituted out of things like alpha, then alpha must have an interpretation in the perceptual articulatory system, which is independent of the language in question. In other words, the perceptual articulatory system is getting all of its information about the expression from just this. That's always been the tacit assumption about the PF level, and now I'm making it explicit. If it didn't look like that, your teacher tells you that's not phonetic representation. Well, why? Because of this principle. Okay? Now, at the PF level, this is also trivial in a way that it's almost pointless to point out because everybody just assumes it and has always assumed it, but it isn't pointless. You might as well understand what we're doing. And when we transfer it over to LF, it becomes, here it helps us, guides us through a morass. Okay? So let's carry over exactly the same concepts and assume that LF works exactly the way PF does, nothing new. That means there must be some notion of legitimate LF object, and a representation at LF is going to satisfy full interpretation if it consists of those things. Every one of those things must have a language independent universal interpretation in conceptual and intentional systems, okay? Because it provides all the information that the use of language or the understanding of language requires. And if a derivation ends up with such a thing, we'll say it converges at LF. If it doesn't, we'll say it crashes at LF. Next question. What are the legitimate LF objects? Well, notice that that's a question analogous to the question of universal phonetics. Like the big subject, universal phonetics, what are the objects that are legitimate at PF in this sense? It's not the way it's usually put, but that's what it amounts to. So now we ask the same question about LF. Well, a good start is the assumption that what they are chains. And there seem to be certain kinds of chains that are legitimate objects. So, for example, there are heads, where a head is a chain x0 t, a lot of other things. Okay, t is going to be an x0 also. There are arguments. Arguments are going to be things of xp trace where they're all A positions. I'll come back to what that notion means. There are modifiers. Modifiers are things like that again, where they're all A bar positions. And the only other thing that seems to be around is operator variable constructions, which are things of the form xp trace, where this is an A bar position and this is an A position. As far as we know, those are the only objects, and they all get natural interpretations at LF. Okay? So let's assume that those are the legitimate LF objects, period. To make them clear, we have to explain these notions, but let's just take them in the intuitive sense for a moment. If that's correct, then a derivation will converge at LF if the representation that it forms is completely constituted out of those objects. Now, once it converges at LF, it may be complete gibberish, but of course the same is true at PF. You could form something at PF that's just gibberish, but it would still have some way of being said and being heard, and the same is true at LA. Form something in PS that's just gibberish, but it would still have some way of being said and being heard, and the same is true at LA. Well, next step, we got to define A and A bar position. Now, in LGB, these had definitions, but in all work of the last, say, 7 or 8 years, they've lost their definitions. People haven't been as bothered by that fact as they should have been. But the LGB definitions of A and A bar position were based on certain assumptions. One assumption, crucial assumption, was that theta relationship is sisterhood. Okay, that's a crucial assumption. And in fact, if you drop that assumption, the definition of A and A bar position collapses. Well, that assumption has been given up years ago, for all kinds of reasons. And in fact, nobody believes it anymore. But the trouble is, if you stop believing it, you no longer have the notion A and A bar position. And since virtually all the technical work in the field uses these notions, none of it means anything. It's kind of a serious problem. It has some, we sort of know intuitively what we're talking about, but there's no characterization of it because it was characterized in a framework of assumptions which are no longer accepted. So we need something new. Well, what do we want? I think what we want is probably something like this. Let's think back to the sort of core story. The core story is that everything is a kind of reflection of properties of lexical items. Okay? So, for example, let's take verbs. Everything's a property of lexical items. Now, if you look at the V system, the system of verbs, and you think of this, Pollock-style story, or in fact almost anybody's story, you got a verb you pick a verb out of the lexicon, and in the course of the derivation, it somehow picks up inflections, like it picks up agreement and tense and whatever else it may have. Okay, how does it do that? Well, there's two stories. One story is it does it by adjunction. So you've got an inflectional element and a verb, and the verb adjoins, and then it's got the inflection. That's the usual way it's looked at, Baker-style adjunction, head movement. And there's another possibility. The other possibility, more in the spirit of lexicalist phonology, and the one I'm going to adopt, is that you pull the verb out of the lexicon with all its features. Okay, and that it still raises to the inflectional elements, but the operation that takes place there is checking. Okay, so when you raise V to I, any of the inflectional elements, and you form this, what happens is that in this configuration you check the V feature and you see if I has it. Okay, if we were smart and you picked, say tense over here and tense over here, then they check and you're in business. The derivation can converge. If you happen to pick, say, minus tense here and plus tense here, you're in trouble. The derivation crashes. Okay, that's an alternative way of looking at it, kind of in the spirit of lexicalist phonology. Let's pick that way. Turns out a lot follows. Well, let's pick it. Abstractly, we have there's not much of an argument one way or another. But let's pick that way. Now, it now follows that what are we going to say now about, say, French and English? We're going back to the position of spell out at the moment. What we're going to say is that in French, V has to have its features checked before spell out. In English, it has to have its features checked after spell out. Okay. Notice, incidentally, that one of the main arguments for one of the basic assumptions of the Emmons-Pollock type approach now collapses. We don't have to say that the inflectional features lower in overtly. They don't have to lower at all. They can just stay where they are. The reason everybody assumed that they lowered is that the verb actually has the features phonetically. But of course, if it comes out of the lexicon with them, well, okay, fine. Just had them and didn't yet get checked. So we can drop the whole story about lowering. There's a lot of reason for doing that. If you have lowering and then raising, and you think about the mechanics of adjunction, the structure of a verb in English, or an English-type language, ought to be very different from the structure of a verb in a French-type language, and it isn't. The structure of the verb is identical. but they would come out quite different if you had lowering and then raising. So in fact, let's say you don't have lowering at all. In fact, let's knock out lowering as an option even. It's not even a possibility. And you just have raising in both cases. But in English, you have raising after spell out, and in French before spell out. We still have to state that fact at TF, but let's proceed. Now it turns out that tense and agra, all of those things, are features of V, right? They're what we might call V features. They have the property that when a V raises to them, they look and say, we match or we don't match. So let's call such things V features. Okay. And more generally, let's speak of L features, where L is any lexical item. So you can have N features and V features and A features and so on. All right, now let's go back to A and A bar positions and recall that the basics, we only have two basic relations, spec head and head complement. And now let's simply distinguish two categories of positions. One, the relationships where H is has an L feature, and the other, the case where H doesn't have an L feature. Very elementary. Okay, what has L features? Well, lexical items, of course, like the verb has the L features, and all the things that are going to check off its features, like agra and tense, but notice not C. C is not a V feature. I mean, verbs may raise to C, but if they are, it's really the inflection that's raising to C. Movement to C, V second is actually I second, because the verb is already raised to I, and the thing that's moving is an I. And what's going to drive it is some requirement on the I system, not the V system. It's independent of the V, in fact. Okay, factually and even structurally. So we have L features like tense and agra, and we have non-L features like negation. I didn't put that in the big story, but that'll be somewhere. C and so on, and of course we've got all the positions that are just adjoined, which obviously aren't L-related in this sense. All right, let's take L-related to be sort of a first shot at A position. Actually, more is involved in this, but let's take that as a first shot, and we take everything else to be A bar position. We can now very easily proceed to give Gert's trichotomy. That comes out as a very natural set of three positions, so I'll leave that to you as an exercise. But we've got the basic story of A and A bar position. Okay, L-related and non-L-related. But now now let's proceed further and return to the point of spell out. Okay, notice that a feature like the V feature of agra. Let's take a look at the V feature of agra, or the V feature of tense.
That is the complementizer in the L system.
Complementizer is just a non-L feature. It's a non-V feature. It's just itself. And in fact, it has many properties distinct from tense and agreement.
So its specifier would still be...
Its specifier is an A-bar position because it's not an L-related position.
And even in languages where the complementizer is spelled out on the verb...
Now, if the verb moves to the complementizer position, if the inflectional element moves to the complementizer position, that specifier is going to become an A position because it's now going to be L-related, which is which one. Yeah. Okay. So yeah, that would follow. So take, say, Ritzi's line on that you could put in.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Provoked another question. You have a language like English, let's say, where the verb doesn't move to I.
I think it does move to LF. So it's got to move at LF because the features have to be checked. If features are unchecked, you don't converge. And it's enough for the positions to be defined at LF because remember, I'm going to try to move to a system where nothing happens with S structure. There's no such thing. Okay, so all the conditions will be interface conditions. So all we have to do is define them at LF. What happens at S, what we used to call S structure in this theory is just kind of...
What I had in mind was if our language is where the specifier C is an A-bar position, could there also be a language where the specifier of I is an A-bar position?
Presumably not. I mean, I don't know. I mean, I'm assuming it's a language universal that the features like tense and agreement are features of verbs. Verbs just have that property. I mean, not all. Like you might have a root verb that doesn't pick them up, but that's universal also. Some verb is going to pick them up, or else you don't have an expression. That's the assumption. So very few options permitted here. Maybe that's too few, but that's the assumption. Okay. Now let's think for a second about what these things like V features are doing Okay, what is the V feature of a verb doing? You know, the V feature of an agra doing. Agra is sitting up here, or tense. You know, any of these I things are sitting up here. They have a specifier. Some verb is moving up to a join to them. Okay, that's true whether it's tense or either of the agras. And what is the function of this thing? Well, one function of it is it's checking off the properties of V. Okay, it's saying, yeah, you picked the right property of V. Another property of it is picking up it's spelling out the properties of N. It's saying, yeah, you got the right thing in here. Like, say it's, you know, this is a singular noun and this is a singular verb. The I is saying, you guys match. Okay, that means that the I must actually have a V feature and an N feature, and they got to be the same. Okay, some feature that says something about the N, some feature that says something about the V. They basically have to be the same. Now, once the I feature has done its work, it's going to disappear. Its only role is to establish a relationship between a verb, which was way down there, and a noun phrase, which was always also somewhere else that ended up here at LS. Okay, so once it's, and notice, in fact, that when you have inflections, you see them twice, not 3 times at most. Like you may see an inflection in the noun and in the verb, you're never going to see it some other place. Okay, so what's got to be going on, and the only thing that makes sense, is that the inflectional elements have I features. Check off the I, they check off the V's, and they check off the, they have V features and N features. They got to be checking off the V's, checking off the N's. If they both check off properly, you get convergence. If not, you crash, and then they disappear. That's what they've got to be doing, so let's assume that that's what they are doing. And let's go back now to the S structure position of spell out. Okay, we now have to turn to the question of why in French, how do we state the fact, the parametric difference between, say, French type and English type languages, now that we no longer have S structure? Well, recall that that had to be a difference stated in terms of morphological properties of PF. Okay, that was forced. Now let's see if we can do it. Well, recall Polluck's intuition. What did Polluck say about this? What he said is that the agreement element is strong in French and weak in English. Okay, and then comes the whole technology about theta assignment that tells you that the verbs raise in French and don't in English. All right, let's keep the intuition but drop the technology. Okay, so keep the same intuition. Say it's got something to do with strength of agreement. That's what makes French type different from English type. And now let's make the obvious move. We're talking now about the V features of agra. Okay, Polluck is saying, and let's accept, that they are strong in French, weak in English. Now what does that mean? Well, we'll give a natural elementary interpretation of that. We'll say if a V feature is strong, it's visible at PF. You can see it. If it's weak, it's invisible at PF, or maybe it just deletes in the PF component. And that's what strong and weak means. Okay? If a feature is strong, it's strong enough so it's going to get all the way to the PF level. Okay? If it's weak, it kind of disappears along the way, or else you don't see it at PF. Okay, that's the meaning now. No more technology about theta role assignment or anything like that. Okay, now what happens? Well, remember the V features are strong in French of agra, but weak in English. Okay, suppose that you have raising before spell out in French. Well, you raise to agra, the V feature takes a look and says, okay, I check or I don't check. If I don't check, you crash and you stop. If you do check, the V feature goes away. It's done its job. Okay. If it's done its job, you can go off to PF and you never run into any trouble. Suppose you left the V down below. Okay. Suppose you left the V down below, like in English. Well, then the agra is sitting up there with its V feature, not checked, so not disappearing. It goes off to PF. It is visible at PF. The derivation crashes. You don't have legitimate. That's like a stressed consonant. Okay, the thing crashes. So that's the case where a morphological property at PF forces raising. Now what about English? Well, in English, all we have so far is you don't have to raise at PF. Okay, you don't have to raise before spell out because even if you don't raise before spell out, since the agra feature, the V feature of agra is weak, it's not going to be visible at PF. So what makes it impossible to raise? Well, what makes it impossible to raise is a very natural economy principle. Let's call it procrastinate. And the principle says that LF operations are cheap and overt operations are costly. Okay? LF operations are basically costless. They're just kind of like wired-in reflexes. But overt operations actually have an effect, that is given, and they vary and so on. So they actually cost something. They're real. When you check up the cost of a derivation, you can forget the LF part at first approximation. Actually, you've got to consider it for other reasons, but cheaper than PF, pre-PF. Okay. So overt operations add to the cost of a derivation, but the rest of the stuff is just reflex. Happens automatically. Okay. If we make that assumption, then it follows that if you don't have to move it before spell out, you can't move before spell out, because there's always a more economical derivation that didn't, and the more economical one's always going to block the less economical one. Okay. This happens to have lots of consequences, but here's one. So on the basis of that economy principle, let's now assume it, kind of a lateness principle. It says do everything as late as possible. If it's not going to, if you can get a derivation to converge without having a visible effect, do it that way. If you can do it in your head without making it come out your mouth, do it that way. That's basically what it comes down to. Okay. So assuming procrastinate, which will have lots of consequences, that's one of the main economy principles, then English is forced not to raise, and French is forced to raise. Okay, on the basis of a PF condition, a morphological PF condition. Well, in fact, as far as I know, all of the properties of that kind can be explained this way. That would be the difference between a raising language and a lowering language. What about the difference between a VSO language and an SVO language? In other words, what about the extended projection principle? Well, we could describe that in precisely the same way. Now we would be talking about the N feature, and actually, if you think it through, it's got to be the N feature of tense. If the N feature of tense is strong, then you've got to check it off before spell out, which means you had to have raised. That's the extended projection principle. If the N feature of tense is weak, you don't have to do it, therefore you can't do it. Let's say Irish. You're still doing it, but at LF. Because everything's got to look identical at LF for all languages. But, difference in positions. Now, notice that there's now a very narrow typology of possible languages. We have agra and tense. Each has an N feature and a V feature. Each can be strong or weak, period. That should be the full typology of languages. Now, that's a very strong claim. I don't know if it's right, but it's right as far as I know. That would say that's the full typology of languages with regard to the point of spell out. What about things like WH and C2? Well, notice that that's going to involve, on these principles, an operator feature of C. Okay, if something is going to be allowed to move to spec C only if it's forced to move to XC, because nothing is allowed to happen unless it's forced. Everything's got to be driven by a morphological requirement. And that means that C must have an operator feature which is strong if you have overt WH movement. Now, if Watanabe is right, it's always strong. Okay, that would be the Q element that people talk about. Would always be strong, means there's always overt movement to it. Okay, so Q would now just be the strong operator feature of C. Well, let me take a last. Is enough if I go on for a few minutes? Well, let me give a stronger argument about binding theory, and then I'll stop. Let's look at some things that are really problems, or look like problems. Let's take a case of Pied Piping. Okay, so take a sentence like, "In which house does John live?" Okay, and think about the structure of that. We've got a chain. The chain is, let's call this alpha. The chain is alpha t, but the problem is that alpha t isn't a legitimate object. It's not an operator variable construction. It's not an argument. It's not anything. So therefore, this thing ought to crash at LF. So what do we do? Well, there's only one thing we can do. The natural thing we can do is the way this is usually looked at again is reconstruction. Okay, what you do is reconstruct, and you turn it into an operator variable, an operator up here, and you reconstruct in which house down here, and you get something like for which X John lived in X house, or John lived in X. So in fact, you get two possibilities. Which house John lives in X, and then you have a principle that tells you that's the operator binding that. This is actually the trace. Or you get which John lives in T house, okay, where this is a variable ranging over the D, presumably, ranging over determiners. The answer to this one would be that. In which house does John live? That. The answer to this would be the red one. Okay, those are two interpretations. Now that's usually, if people talk about this at all, they say it's reconstruction. But what's reconstruction? That's a very crazy operation. I've already tried to get rid of it in one class of cases. Reconstruction is a particularly crazy operation when it happens at LF, after LF movement. So there's a lot of theories around which do LF movement and then reconstruction. It means they move something up, and then they move it back down again, all invisible. We really ought to be concerned about that. Okay. Now, suppose the natural approach, one class of reconstruction cases I've already eliminated by replacing LF movement by absorption. Now let's take a look at these cases. Well, there is a kind of an old-fashioned way of eliminating reconstruction, and that's to reinterpret movement so that the trace that's left by movement is actually a copy. Okay. Suppose we do that. We say the trace that's left by movement is actually a copy, so what we really have here is in which house John lives in which house. That's the trace. Well, of course, we don't hear this, but that's going to follow from general principles, which will yield ellipsis and all sorts of other things. You don't hear a copy. The PF component knocks out copies and chains. I think that's probably the explanation for most ellipses, maybe all ellipses. Okay, so and in fact they're quite general. So let's say, okay, that's what happens at PF. But now let's proceed down to LF. What happens at LF? Well, at LF we now have alpha T, where alpha and T are identical. Okay. Well, now what do? We have to form an operator variable construction. Otherwise, it's not a legitimate object. Remember, LF is all automatic computation. Okay. How does it work? Well, the obvious way for it to work is by an operation kind of like QR, which takes the WH phrase, puts it in front, and leaves a residue. And notice there are two ways in which this could work. You could get which house T, okay, that's alpha. Okay, and just ordinary QR, pull out which house. Or you could pull out which sorry, I forgot, in T, which house in T. That's one way of pulling out the operator. The other way of pulling out the operator is just to take the which alone and get which house in T house. Okay? Those are the two ways in which QR could work. No other ways. Okay? So let's say that's what it does. And of course, it's going to work in both of these things, right? Because they're both identical. All right, now let's ask ourselves what happens. We now turn in which house into either this or this, depending on which option we pick. And down here we also have the same two options. Okay? Now what do? Well, we know what LF is supposed to look like. What LF is supposed to look like is that in the operator position we have an operator. Okay, so if we want to converge at LF, if we want convergence at LF, we have to eliminate this at LF, and we have to eliminate the operator down here. Okay? Notice I don't have to say this. If you don't do it, you just don't converge at LF. You don't get a legitimate object. So let's say that the only thing we have to say is you've got QR, you have deletion, period. Those are the only things. Do them any way you like. Out of all the ways of doing them, only two are going to work, giving you convergence at LF. One that's going to work is to take the operator WH over here and to take in T down here. The other way that's going to work is to take the operator which over here and to take in T house down here. Nothing else is going to work. If you do either of those things, you get legitimate objects. In fact, you get an operator and a variable. And an operator and a variable is a legitimate object. So those are the only two things that are going to work. Everything else is going to crash. So all we have to say is, at LF you have QR and deletion, period. Then do them any way you please, and these are the two ways that are going to come out. Okay. If you pick either of these two ways, you're going to get the effective reconstruction. So we can drop reconstruction. Okay. Reconstruction now just becomes the LF operation, QR, and deletion. Notice, incidentally, it's also going to follow that you get reconstruction only in A-bar movements, because that's the only case where you're going to get QR, and that's a well-known fact. You don't get reconstruction in A movements, but it follows now. That's been a big problem, incidentally, in reconstruction theory. But that just follows from the fact that reconstruction depends on the existence of an operator, so you can apply QR. Okay. Now, by reconstruction, I mean a whole class of reconstruction effects under binding and all that stuff. For example, for those of you who are familiar with Dave LeBeau's approach to reconstruction, it foundered on the fact that it should have, given his arguments, it should have worked at A-bar for A movement too, but now we can see why it doesn't. It can't apply for A movement. There's no, the equivalent of reconstruction doesn't work. Okay, now let's proceed to binding theory. Okay, and let's take a look at expressions like, I talked about condition C and why we weren't forced to apply it at LF. Let's take a look at condition A. What about condition A? Well, that's the crucial sentences are going to be things like, John wondered which picture of himself Bill saw. Okay, things like that. That's going to be the relevant class of cases. Now notice that these are ambiguous. They're ambiguous because himself could be either John or it could be Bill. Okay? So the way this is usually handled is to say, well, if you look at this structure, you get John. If you do reconstruction or something or other, some kind of, then you get a complicated S structure operation like Andy Barson says you can get Bill. We don't want any of those things because we don't want S structure operations and nothing. Okay. So what we're going to say is now the following. The trace down here is just which picture of himself. Which picture of himself. And recall that we had two options, right? We had two options for QR, the obvious two. You could just you could pull out the whole phrase, in which you get which picture of himself T, or we could just pull out the which and get which T picture of himself. So it's the same two options I gave before, right? Just depending on whether you take the WH to be a D operator or an XP operator. A D operator or a DP operator in DP theory. Okay, so that's straightforward. Now, notice that to get convergence, you got to do the same thing down here that you did up here. We didn't have to say that. It's just not going to converge otherwise. Okay, so that means you got those two options down here too. If you pick this option, the himself is going to remain upstairs at LS. If you take this option, the himself is going to remain downstairs at LS. Okay, so that gives you the two ambiguities. The ambiguities just depend on which of the two options you pick. Okay, so we're straight. We don't have any argument for S structure. That's a weak argument against S structure. Works fine at LS. Now let's take see if we can get a strong argument against S structure. An argument that shows things can't happen at S structure. Well, try replacing saw by take. Okay, now take the sentence, John wondered which picture of himself Bill took. Okay, notice that which picture did you take is ambiguous. Just a simple sentence, which picture did you take is ambiguous lexically. Take can either mean literally pick up and walk away with, or take a picture can mean photograph. Okay, you got that ambiguity. Now notice the following fact. We got now two ambiguities. Pardon?
Is it at all critical that these ambiguities surface in the English representation that may not surface in representation in another language?
No. This is just this accidental property of English that it happens to have the idiom take a picture, which means photograph.
The anaphora of himself.
I'm talking about one category of anaphora. You're going to have to extend the argument to other categories. As far as I know, it doesn't matter. I mean, there are some differences in anaphora, yeah. But let's run it through, okay? I think you get similar arguments with other kinds of anaphora. We now have four possible interpretations. Take could be either literal or idiomatic. Take a picture, meaning photograph, or pick it up and walk away with. And you can have either anaphora. But notice you don't get all four possibilities. One of the possibilities is knocked out. If you interpret take idiomatically, so take a picture means photograph, you must be using the downstairs anaphora. Okay? So one option is out. The option that's out is where you have the upstairs anaphora and the idiomatic interpretation. Okay, why? Well, we have an answer to that on the assumption that, first of all, notice that if condition A holds at S structure, there's no reason for that to be true. You could relate himself to John any way you feel like, and then you could do the idiomatic and do whatever you do at LF independently of that. So you get all four, but you don't get all four. Notice we now have an extremely strong argument against allowing condition A to apply at S structure. If it did, we ought to get all four possibilities, but we don't. Now, do we have an explanation at LF? Answer, yes, an obvious explanation. Notice that take a picture at LF. The ambiguity of take has got to be an LF property, right? It used to be in earlier theories. It could be stated as a D structure property, but we don't have D structure anymore. It's got to be an LF property because there isn't anything else, and that's the natural place for it anyway. I mean, the natural place for idiom interpretation is LF, so let's assume it's right. So at LF, we have the option of taking this unit and saying it means photograph. That's an idiom, okay? But in order to apply that option at LF, the unit has to exist at LF. If it doesn't exist, you can't apply the option, okay? Which means the only case where you can apply the idiomatic interpretation is the one in which you picked this case of reconstruction of QR. If you pick this option for QR, you're going to have to physically take a picture down here, then you can give it the idiomatic interpretation, but of course that forces downstairs anaphora. Okay? If you picked the other option, this one, you're just not going to have take a picture down here at all, because the picture's still up there, and therefore you can't apply the idiom interpretation. So in fact, the fact of the matter is there is a level of representation which has two properties. One, you give three properties. One, you give idiomatic interpretations there. Two, you don't hear it. Three, binding theory applies there. Okay? Now what could have those three properties? Well, only one thing, LF. Okay? So in fact, we now have an overwhelming argument that condition A can't apply at S structure. Decisive argument, the strongest kind. Furthermore, we have an extremely strong argument for LF. In fact, that's the strongest argument I know for the existence of LF. Namely, that there's got to be a level with the property A, you don't hear it, B, binding theory applies there, 3, idiom interpretation applies there. And the only possible candidate for that is LF in anybody's theory. In fact, in this theory, it's forced if you don't have any other level. Okay. Well, that's the strongest kind of argument against an S-structure condition. Yeah.
But then, in condition or in conjunction with what you said about reconstruction,
there isn't any reconstruction anymore.
Yeah. Would wrongly predict that you couldn't get idioms like advantage seems to have been taken.
No. So that's an A movement case.
Right.
And
you could reconstruct.
You don't. No, but you have. No, but you have advantage down below. See, you have advantage down below, right? So you do it either way. Yeah, you copy. Yeah. So it's just a question of how you interpret the chain. Yeah. You don't get the effect of reconstruction because that requires analysis of the phrase into a quantifier and an operator. But you still get idiom interpretation. Okay. Now, notice the next thing to look at, I'm not going to say anything about it, would be case theory. There's a very powerful argument that case theory has to be at S structure. The argument is very straightforward. You need it both at PF and LF. You need it at PF because you hear it. You need it at LF because of the way it interacts with things like theta criterion and so on. But notice that on a checking theory of features, that argument is gone because you don't. It doesn't have to happen before PF. If you didn't check the case feature before spell out, it's going to be there anyway because you pulled the thing out of the lexicon with it. Okay, the case feature is only going to be checked when the phrase that has it moves into the spec head position, and that could perfectly well be LF. But since all that does is checking, you don't care. So the strong argument in favor of the case theoretic condition at S structure disappears. There are a lot of other arguments. There are things about exceptional case marking, and why don't you get John Seam's bill to be intelligent, all that kind of stuff. And you got to show that those work. Actually, I think they do, but they involve rather intricate considerations of economy conditions, which I don't have time to go on. All right, assuming that this is kind of like a sketch of a program. Assuming you can do it, what do you end up with? Incidentally, let's take another look at this LF condition on binding theory. Notice that if this is correct, we can now move to what is clearly the optimal theory of binding. Notice why. If binding theory applies at LF only, not at S structure, then we can say the following. First of all, we can eliminate all indices. We don't care what kind of indices. We don't need any indication throughout the syntax of anything. You only needed them if things were happening at S structure, but now it's not. And what will binding theory come down to? Well, binding theory will come down to the following, usual three conditions, but now stated on LF representations. And it'll say basically this: if alpha is an anaphore, it must find an antecedent within some local domain. You can define that as you like. If alpha is a pronominal, it must be disjoint from everything in the local domain. And if alpha is an R expression, it's got to be disjoint from everything that's in a bigger domain, the sequence answers. Okay? Notice that that's the most trivial formulation of binding theory, and it unifies disjoint reference and distinct reference, which is an extremely tricky business. The only way that that's been done so far is with set indices and all sorts of things like that. If you want details, have a look at Lasnik's stuff. But we can throw out all that stuff. We can throw out set indices. We can throw out any indices, in fact. This is, in effect, a version of the on-binding theory of anaphora, which was the only one around that ever unified disjoint and distinct reference, okay, but did it in terms of mechanisms that look too complicated. We can now throw out the mechanisms and keep the theory, okay, and in fact throw out indices altogether. That's a very good idea. Indices should not really exist, and all the work that uses indices is extremely suspect. See, the indices, here you got to separate engineering from science, sort of. An index is just a way of expressing a relationship, right? It can't be a thing in itself, I mean, an index ought to be replaceable by coloring two things the same color, for example. It's just an expression of a relationship, or by statement of a structural configuration. Now, there's all kinds of workaround which uses indices as if they're real, like indices percolate, and they move from here to there and so on. It's totally meaningless, It's like saying a piece of a relationship percolates. It doesn't mean anything, And in fact, the best way to undercut it all is just to drop indices, period. And if you can have binding theory apply at LF, you can, in fact, drop indices, and you can also unite distinct and disjoint reference in a natural way. Well, I don't know. Let's stop here. And I should say one thing about ECP. Notice there's going to be quite an obvious account of why at least the relativized minimality cases of ECP work out. The obvious account is that not only must steps of derivation be as few as possible, but they also must be as short as possible. So if you've got a derivation that's with shorter links, it beats one with longer links. Okay, that essentially gives you two things, relativized minimality and also superiority. Superiority is also a case where you pick longer links instead of shorter ones. You got to state that correctly, but that would unify those two cases of ECP, which do fall together, I think. Well, okay, that's a sketch. Here's the kind of conclusions which would come out if you can fill in the blanks. The conclusions would be that a linguistic expression, that the only levels of representation are the interface levels, the ones that are forced. Okay. A linguistic expression will be just the optimal realization of interface conditions, period. Nothing else to say about it. All conditions will, of course, apply to the interface because that's all there is. Okay. Very close to what's conceptually necessary. Though notice that it requires a very specific understanding of what a computation is and what the best computation is. And the program would state as follows: if we can find that conception, looks like we ought to be able to come very close to a kind of a God-designed language, one which has just the conceptually necessary properties understood from a particular and quite natural perspective. That would be the minimalist program. And the point of this comment was to suggest to it that you can get a lot closer to it than one might have thought, maybe all the way. Okay.
Okay. I would like to thank Noam Chomsky for this talk. It was truly exciting, and we'll hope to see something written soon so we can study it in more detail. Thanks for coming.